Hello, friends. Welcome to the Nexus podcast. I'm your host, James Dice. Each week, I fire questions at the leaders of the smart buildings industry to try to figure out where we're headed and how we can get there faster without all the marketing fluff. I'm pushing my learning to the limit, and I'm so glad to have you here following along. Before we get started, here's a quick note from our sponsor. I want to remind all of you about the Building Analytics Comparison Guide, which was a collaboration between us at Nexus Labs and the team at Clockworks Analytics. It's used by industry-leading facilities teams and service provider organizations to make the jump from building automation system alarms to prioritized and proactive maintenance using fault detection and diagnostic software. In the guide, we show how there are actually two kinds of fault detection diagnostic software: those that stop at the first D, detection, and those that go all the way to diagnostics. And this guide tells the story of the second D and why it's so important. So get the guide at the link in the show notes. This episode is a conversation with Brad White, president of SES Consulting, and Leo Glaser, manager of environmental sustainability at Concert Properties in Canada. The theme here is decarbonization from the trenches. Most property owners don't have a real detailed plan for decarbonizing their portfolios, despite widespread corporate commitments to do just that. So we talk about the steps in building a roadmap, how Concert Properties built theirs, how they make the business case, the role of smart building technology, and Brad even gets on a soapbox to send two messages out that I think a lot of us need to hear right now. These are lessons from the trenches. One quick announcement before we dive in: if you like this topic, this month's Nexus Pro Member Gathering will feature BXP's Ben Myers and will highlight their journey and give everyone a chance to fire questions at the man responsible for decarbonizing 50 million square feet. So join Nexus Pro now to get the invite. And without further ado, please enjoy the Nexus podcast with Brad White and Leo Glaser. Hello, Leo and Brad. Welcome to the Nexus podcast. Great to have you guys on. Leo, let's start with you. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, James. Thanks for having me today. My name is Leo Glaser. I'm the manager for environmental sustainability at Concert Properties. I've been with the organization for a bit over 2 years, so my field is pretty much leading the ESG department at Concert, and that includes mostly everything that's environmental related to decarbonization, implementing high efficiency and decarbonization projects in our buildings, but also the social and the governance side of the organization.
Cool. Before we go over to Brad, can you give us a little background? Like, what were you doing before Concert? What's your sort of career or educational background?
Yeah, totally. So I did my master's at UBC in clean energy engineering and resource management. And
it's a mouthful.
I kind of created a bit my own field, so a combination of both. And while I was still a student at UBC, I started working for energy and water services, and very similar capacity as the energy analyst, working on energy conservation projects most of the time and analyzing data of campus buildings. And then I moved to Quatrail Property Group in 2017, also as an energy analyst, and worked there for 3.5 years. So I've been working in the commercial real estate work since early 2017, so it's been quite a number of years now.
Got it. And can you give people a background on Concert? What types of buildings, how many of them, where are they?
Yeah, totally. So Concert only has a Canadian portfolio, but it spans, well, across Canada, but mainly in Vancouver and in Toronto. So we're actually more known for being a real estate developer. Pretty much everyone in Vancouver knows Concert Properties for the quality of the condos we built, pretty from like market-based condos to very high ends. And so the properties I take care of, that's a total I think of 135, 137, is a mix of office, residential, and industrial portfolio. So 51 buildings we count as our scope 2 and 1 and 2 emissions. That's a mix of office and residential buildings, and the rest would be in scope 3, which is industrial sites.
Got it. Okay. Well, I'm excited to dig into all of that. Brad, can you jump in? Can you introduce yourself and give a little background on your firm?
Sure, James. I'd be happy to. So I'm Brad White. I'm president of SES Consulting. We're a firm. We're based in Vancouver, Canada. We've got offices kind of throughout BC. And I guess I up until the last couple of years, I would have said we're an energy efficiency engineering firm, but increasingly it's sort of energy and carbon consulting. So we're about 20 people. Our focus is almost exclusively on the existing building market. So everything from energy studies through to design, implementation, verification of energy efficiency and decarbonization projects. My background is as a mechanical engineer. Most of our staff is mechanical engineers, but we also have sort of the softer side of efficiency and sustainability as well, where we do teaching, behavior change, things like that. And so I've been doing this about 15 years now. But really in the last 2 or 3 years, increasingly the conversation is less about, how much money can we save and how much energy can we save, to everyone wants to talk about carbon and decarbonization, which is really aligned with our mission as a company. We're a certified B Corporation. Everyone we hire, we've always kind of been climate nerds. We care about the environment and sustainability. So the shift has been really, really well aligned for us.
Yeah, and I think all three of us then kind of started on the energy efficiency train, and then decarbonization happened, and it's like, well, finally someone cares about this. We're just calling it a different name, but we've been, it's not exactly the same, and we'll unpack that. But it was a relief for me, is like kind of watching this unfold over the last couple of years. And it's like, oh, maybe the long sales cycle, the long internal approval cycles, maybe those are going to start to get shorter nowadays. Well, cool. Let's jump in. I think what I want to start with is the concept of decarbonization in general before we get into like roadmaps. Maybe Leo, if you could start by just saying from your organization, what does that shift mean to Concert in going from energy efficiency, energy management to decarbonization? What is that shift?
So I would say it really depends a bit on the region. In BC, we are fortunate to have a 95-96% clean grid. Most of our electricity comes from hydro energy. And so it's pretty easy to swap out an old gas-fired boiler for an electric heat pump, because everything we replace with an electrical source that is pretty much carbon neutral, right, or pretty close to carbon neutral. If we look into different part of portfolio in Alberta, we have to be a bit more inventive in what we do. So it's more efficiency driven in other regions than it is here in BC. I always compare it to, we could pretty much just go into our buildings and throw out all old gas-fired equipment and install baseboard heaters. If they're electric, I mean, the efficiency is pretty low, but you pretty much decarbonize the entire building, right? So yeah, I would say it depends. I mean, what we had to do in order to focus more on the decarbonization side was really to increase the budgets for the type of projects, right? Because it's just more expensive. It's a fact that if you install a heat pump, it costs more than a gas-fired boiler. So there was a bit a way in educating the organization and making a change to not just look into the numbers, also look into what does it do in the next 10, 15 years regarding the carbon footprint of the buildings.
Totally. Brad, what does that transition meant for you guys as this consulting firm working with a bunch of different type of clients? What does that meant for you?
I mean, as you said, in one way, it's been kind of a relief, because it's the projects we've always wanted to recommend, but historically it was so business case driven that the clients, you have a lot of clients, 2-3 year paybacks is what they wanted. Maybe we had some progressive clients that would take like up to a 10-year payback. But with the shift to decarbonization now, it almost decouples from the business case, because I mean, we run into cases all the time where like there's no payback, like your operation costs are going to be higher. The thing you're getting is that carbon savings, and so that's really liberating in a way, because you end up having a completely different conversation now, and then really you're just looking for the best path to low carbon, not necessarily one that meets a certain business case criteria or certain payback or anything like that. I mean, the financial metrics are still important, but the lens, like, funny, I'm actually starting to teach a course on this, but like we start looking at totally different metrics on either looking at carbon pricing. I mean, we have a carbon tax or carbon price in BC and throughout Canada, one that's set to escalate quite significantly. Well, okay, well, let's factor that in. We work with organizations that have established internal carbon prices. So that's another factor. Or we can just look at, on sort of a life cycle cost per ton. There's all sorts of different interesting ways you can look at these projects to get to the best one. But it's just a very different conversation. And then also trying to get at sort of for each owner, like, what is their trigger? Like, what's driving them to look at this? Is it a corporate ESG target? Is it the need for cooling? I mean, this is a conversation we've been having, which kind of links the climate change adaptation to the climate change mitigation conversation. But 2 summers ago, we had an extreme weather event here where we had temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, so it's well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Like that's not something we've ever experienced here before, and we have a lot of buildings that don't have mechanical cooling. I mean, I'm sure Leo will tell you about some of his residential properties. Historically, no cooling, and so now we're having that conversation. I mean, I've had more conversations about adding cooling in the last year than I had in the previous 15 years I was in this business. And of course, once we're talking about adding cooling, now we're talking about a small incremental cost to make that chiller an air source heat pump instead of just straight cooling. So it's interesting how it links these things together, but you have to understand where your clients are coming from and because it's very easy to get budgets approved to add cooling if you've got tenants who their suites are not habitable because it's so hot, which is the situation we're in, or workplaces that aren't they're outside of safe working limits. Then all of a sudden the money to add cooling to the building is just there. Like, you don't have to sort of justify it the same way we've always had to justify efficiency projects or even standalone decarbonization projects. So really interesting to work with organizations and kind of figuring out where they're at and what their pain points are that we can leverage to make these deep carbon reductions.
And Leo, what is the trigger? I like that framing, Brad. Thank you. What is the trigger for you guys?
It's a bit of everything, I would say. I mean, we have strong corporate carbon reduction goals in place, and we know that we've come to a point where all the low-hanging fruits are pretty much completed, right? We have changed all our lighting to LED. We're at the end of these type of projects, so we have to look into something that really changes the carbon footprint in our buildings, and that to us can't be realized without switching fuel. So I would say yes, it's definitely a corporate goal, but on the other side, like Brad mentioned, I mean, air conditioning will become more and more relevant in our suites. We've had now a number of warmer summers than we had ever experienced in Vancouver before, and I have a great example here, actually, because we piloted 2 heat pumps in a residential building at a small air source heat pump unit, and we measured the energy usage in those suites, but also the temperature. So during the heat wave, when we had 42 degrees Celsius, way over 100 Fahrenheit, right? We noticed that, so we measured in the suites with the air source heat pump that the temperature was between 30 and 32, and in the units without the air source heat pump, it went up to 40 and 45 even, right? Because they were south-facing. So it was a significant temperature difference, because we weren't quite sure if the small heat pumps can handle the heat load in these extreme temperatures, but it did, and the tenants were happy to have them. So I can see this becoming even mandatory in the future, which will also make Brett's and my job easier to sell it to the executive teams, right? Who will sign off on the projects if we have to install air conditioning in the future.
Got it. And what is your organization's carbon target?
So we currently are updating our carbon targets. On our website, we still have the old one, the 80% by 2050. We have been looking into the science-based targets. We So for our asset management team, it was important to develop a decarbonization roadmap before we announce any targets, because we don't want to be an organization that just announces a target but doesn't have an idea how to get there. We want to make sure that we have all our ducks in a row. We want to make sure that our target is data-driven and data-based. And so that's why we worked with Brett together on pretty much developing this roadmap.
Got it. I have spoken a lot in public about how I haven't seen like barely any roadmaps, basically none. I think I read a year ago that I had seen none. And like at this point, maybe one or two, right? And then I got to Greenbuild last week and I saw 2 Canadian REITs. So I was very proud of you Canadians last week when I was at Greenbuild. It was Quadreal and it was another one that I can't remember. I'll put it in the show notes. But they basically had a very detailed roadmap, and that was what the session was about at Greenbuild, and it was awesome. So I'd love to talk about, maybe start with you, Brad. How do you think about, with your clients, getting them to where they've announced a target, they have no plan to get there, they're hoping to figure it out at some point? Where do you start with kind of like creating that roadmap with them?
I mean, it's a good question, and I wouldn't say there's a one-size-fits-all approach for there's so many factors that go into it. And I'll say from the get-go, I don't know that hiring a consultant firm like us is the best way to start. It can be, and we can certainly help you get there. I think increasingly I do see that first step of work being done by a software platform, whether it's someone like Audette or there's a number of platforms out there now, and I think ultimately that's probably how that initial step would be taken, because I mean we're kind of doing the manual version of that. I mean, when we started working with Concert and Leo a few years ago, I mean, there weren't good platforms available at that point. So really the initial, and it's funny because we were doing energy audits and kind of traditional energy audits, and they were funded by our utility, and almost as an afterthought, we were including these low carbon options kind of at the bottom, almost the bottom of the executive summary. So we had all the usual energy efficiency measures, it was control stuff, it was equipment upgrades. And then at the bottom, it'd be like, okay, here are your kind of zero carbon alternatives. And it's funny that wasn't a piece that the utilities were funding. That was just something we kind of did because it was relatively simple to add on once you've kind of done all the work of an audit. But it's that piece that actually turned into the roadmap that has now, I think, Leo could confirm this better than I could, but it's kind of turned into that zero carbon roadmap. Because at the time, again, it was very early in that conversation, and it wasn't sort of everyone's front of mind. Oh, we need these options to hit a certain target. It was like, in conversations like, yeah, we're interested in low carbon. Can you just kind of let us know what that would look like, sort of at a high level? And so we did. As I said, I find it really interesting, that piece that, I don't want to say it was a throwaway, but it was, in terms of the level of effort of the whole audit, that was like a few hours. And it was the most important piece, I think, by far for Concert and how they've planned and approached
Got it.
Meeting their targets. So that's kind of how we did it. We were sort of in the buildings doing a more traditional energy assessment, and then I sort of did this add-on piece to look at heat pump alternatives for various equipment types, and then you guys really seized on that, and it's turned into a plan and actual projects now. Like we've got sort of have delivered full projects at this point that kind of started with a one-liner in an energy study a few years ago, which nice. I think is pretty cool.
Before we get into Concert, I want to circle back on the software piece. So we've had Christopher from Audette on the podcast before. I've obviously written about how the energy spreadsheet must die, and like we have to like get away from doing all that manually. Can you just provide sort of your summary of what software needs to do there?
Yeah, and in full disclosure, that we've got a relationship with Audette.
Yeah.
Audette was a spin-off from within SES. Initially, it's obviously become its own thing now, but I was on the board for a while and stuff. So in terms of what I think where the software needs to go, is to really, and so maybe to take a step back, the best opportunity for any building to make that switch to low carbon is when they're in there replacing equipment anyway. Like the end of the equipment life cycle, it's such a key leverage point in this whole journey to low carbon. Like it's like the most important thing, because like if you miss that opportunity, if you miss that window, like it's 15 years probably before you're going to get another shot at it. And with targets in, you know, the 20, 30, 40, 50 range, like we're now within the life cycle of key equipment where, you know, we're expecting significant carbon reductions to be made. So in my mind, what the software needs to do is to understand that capital equipment like replacement cycle for any building. So I mean, ideally it's a building owner who's got a maintenance database, and they know roughly how old equipment is and roughly when they would want to replace it, and to link that in with a zero carbon plan to say, okay, well here, you know, this boiler will be this air source heat pump, and this rooftop unit will be, you know, this rooftop unit with a heat pump, and this furnace will be an air. So like as step one, and then like that's like the minimum, because now you can see, okay, you can start to do the timeline to say, okay, this is when these major pieces of equipment will likely need to be replaced, and you know, and to see how big of a dent that's going to make in your carbon budget. Because if you know how big the equipment is, and you know how much the building produces in terms of carbon, like you can ballpark it, like you can get in the right order of magnitude anyway, and then start to see like where does that get you. You know, if you know you've got, you know, 20 equipment replacements by 2035 and my target is 50%, like you can start to see, like, am I in the right range, or do I have to do more than just tackle these equipment replacements, or is that actually getting me way past my target? And I think software is really well suited to that, because like that's all pieces of information that software can collect, and you put in some basic assumptions, and it can start to like plot that plan out for you. So and then you kind of have, and then you can see your priority list. You know, okay, these pieces of equipment are my, you know, biggest bang for my buck in terms of carbon reduction, and this other building hardly uses any gas. I'm not even going to worry about that one. And so I think if you get that full picture between sort of facility energy use, carbon production, like those, you know, scope 1 and 2 emissions for each individual buildings, and you know what kind of equipment you're dealing with, and you know when it can be replaced, like that's step one. If you've got a handle on all that, then you're kind of halfway there.
Got it. And yeah, that makes a ton of sense. The thing that's interesting to me there is that's a lot of that work, right, is site level data being turned into site level plans, right? I feel like where a lot of people start, though, is not at the site level, and there's this gap, right, where people are making like portfolio level targets, portfolio level plans, if you can call it that, and then there's a disconnect between like that and the actual device that needs to be replaced down at the ground, right? Do you guys feel that?
You're absolutely right. I think you can still have a portfolio target, because you will have stronger performing buildings, and some of them may already electrify it. So for example, we have a couple of buildings in Victoria that barely use any gas for some reason. The way they were built was already, you know, having electrified building systems in mind. So their carbon footprint is extremely low. Are they extremely efficient? I don't know. Do I care that much anymore? Not really, right? They're not on my priority list anymore because their carbon footprint is so low. I think what needs to be done is, in order to announce a sophisticated carbon target, you have to have the site level data. And I personally would start, and depending on where the organization is at, I would start collecting the utility bills and establishing a baseline. And I know that in many cases, small organizations or large organizations even haven't started that yet. So that was key for us. I mean, we had some data collected before I started with Concert in 2020, but we had a lot of gaps, and we didn't have a energy baseline established. And we were trying to fill all the gaps from 2018 till now, right? So that took a lot of time and effort, reaching out to utilities, making sure we get the invoices, because we wanted to get the data assured. And in order to get the data assured, you need the invoices as a proof, right, when you get audited. So that took quite some time. And then second, I would say what's just to piggyback on Brett here is to really align those identified projects with the equipment replacement schedule. And that when it comes really into talking with the site level staff and your asset manager who oversee the buildings, who know how much is in the budget and how much the how much the building can pretty much afford, right? And so that's what we did. So we formed this ESG committee group of people from property management, from asset management, and we started meeting, I think at the beginning, bi-weekly. So before we started even we called them decarbonization audits because we wanted to move away from energy efficiency. We really wanted to focus more on decarbonization and decarbonization projects. So what we discussed with our consultants was, with Brett, for example, that we created an in-house spreadsheet. A spreadsheet everyone at Concert would understand and has their metrics in there. Because I look more into carbon reduction, or how much is it going to cost me to reduce 1 ton of carbon, to kind of establish a bit and an idea how much our average project costs, right? So, but our asset management group wanted to see net present values and other metrics, right? I had not previously included. So we created this master spreadsheet, and that was shared with all our consultants across Canada. We engaged in this process of decarbonization audits. And then after all these audits were completed, we pretty much copied these projects together. And we had, at this point, I didn't know when these projects could be realized, right? Because some were in the $1 million range, others were in a couple of 10,000s, completely all over the place, depending on the asset. But we sat together with our property managers and the asset managers to really go through each building's equipment replacement schedule and each budget. And I mean, it's still an ongoing process. We have aligned all these projects, and there's a couple of hundred in that spreadsheet now for all 55 properties that we have in our scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the interesting thing is really like that, obviously you have some years where you expect multiple systems to break down, or they're scheduled for replacement in those certain years. And like Brett said, right, you cannot realize all these projects in 1 year, but having the knowledge and having all this data allows you to reallocate these projects through the different years. So you can say, well, maybe we have the ability to push the one boiler project out, or the one RTU out to another year, and do only these projects this year. So it gives you a lot of more flexibility. And one thing I also want to mention here is that I ran into so many boilers that broke down, and no one had the time to really look into an electric alternative, right? Because you need to replace your boiler. That could be during the shoulder season, or even in winter when it breaks down. So you want to go in and make sure that your tenants have heat, mm-hmm. right? So in many cases, you just don't have the time to do a decarbonization audit. The good thing in our case is now we know what to do. So it can happen anytime. We have the alternative. We have an understanding, what heat pump size we need to get. Obviously, it would take some engineering work to design the project, but at least we're not blank. We don't have to replace boilers for boilers. We know what it will take and how much it will cost to replace it with a heat pump.
Yeah, totally. So when you look at this list of several hundred projects, can you talk about what are the other inputs? Is it only NPV for financials? Are you looking at net operating income? Or are you looking at anything else like that? And then how do you prioritize the project? So besides like these things are scheduled to be replaced on this year, or this thing broke down last week, how do you then prioritize and then get the budget for, how do you pay for it, the stuff that wasn't planned before?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that are key here. So first, we also look into funding and funding opportunities for certain projects, whether that's here in BC or in Ontario or in Alberta. And then we look into financial savings. So do we reduce enough gas? Do we actually see an operational benefit in it? And in some cases, unfortunately, we don't, unless the efficiency of the project increases the building efficiency by so much that we actually, save a lot of energy overall, and that is reflected in the ongoing operational expense. In many cases, unfortunately, because electricity is still more expensive than gas, right? We don't really see the savings there. But besides any financial aspect here, I would say that the priority is really given to the buildings that have a heating system coming up for replacement. Because if they miss the one replacement, right, we're stuck with a boiler for the next 18 years again. So it's really timing is key here, and I just talked with our asset managers about this, and because they asked me, hey, does it still matter like how carbon inefficient a building is? Would you prioritize the building? And I would say yes, we still do. I mean, we would still focus on those high emitters, right? Because we obviously want to reduce the carbon pollution as soon as we can. But it wouldn't be a boiler replacement unless the boiler is due, right? We would go in and see what else we can do to improve efficiency. But those bigger items, the heat pumps, RDUs, MUAs, everything that can be electrified, that's really just based on the equipment replacement schedule.
Got it. Anything to add there, Brad?
I was just going to say, like, I think that mindset, like, is really key for an organization, that, like, every time you replace an equipment like for like is a lost opportunity. I think if you can kind of get to that cultural shift where you're sort of appreciating that, like, that is your opportunity, because, I mean, yeah, even if the building's not, quote unquote efficient, you should still do the decarbonization project if that's your only opportunity, because you can do the efficiency after. But if you put a new boiler in there, like, it's going to be really hard to get the low carbon equipment after that, because who wants to replace a brand new boiler, right? So I think like it in some ways it's counterintuitive, but I think for an organization to actually be successful and make meaningful progress towards their goals, like on a big way, that you gotta leverage those equipment replacement opportunities, almost irregardless of whether it is like your highest emitter or is otherwise a facility that should be prioritized. Like you kind of have to do it, because if you don't, you're not going to get to the deep reductions that you're targeting. Like, yeah, you could get 25, 30, 40% reduction maybe, but you're not going to get 50, 60, 70, 80% reduction without those equipment replacements.
Yeah, I've been on a little bit of a personal crusade to spread the term committed emissions around. So I was at the Verge conference in San Jose a couple of weeks ago, and I had, I was speaking in a panel, and I had a room full of 100 people, and I said, raise your hand if anyone's heard, like, who's heard of the term committed emissions? And I was planning on calling on the person to have them define it, but no one in the whole room raised their hand, including the other panelists, and we were talking about ESG. We weren't talking specifically about decarbonization, but we were, this is included in the ESG umbrella, right? And not a single person in the room, unless they were being really shy, had heard the term committed emissions. And so I just feel like we have to figure out how to spread this knowledge of equipment replacement timing is extremely, extremely important. I think everyone that's sort of in Leo's role is already understands that. It's the only lever we have, right? But I think more and more people throughout the industry need to understand that term. What is the role? This is kind of my last sort of portfolio level question, and then I kind of want to zoom in, kind of get into the ground stories. What is the role right now from your guys' perspective in carbon accounting specifically? So there's a lot of different software, features or entire software companies that are popping up around, hey, I know you have utility bills and you have meter data, but it'd really be nice if you had accurate carbon data from that. How much do you guys think about that piece of this puzzle?
Well, I mean, we basically just follow the national standards, right, and apply the national carbon emission factors to the energy sources across the country. We're using an energy management tool that does it automatically. And then in the end, every year we get our data assured. So I'm not sure how much carbon accounting tools would add to that, to be honest. I think we have a pretty good understanding. We monitor our carbon data constantly, I would say, making sure that we don't have any gaps, and our data is pretty accurate. And then half the year, well, by mid-year, the carbon factors change again, so you have to redo it and update all your baseline data again. And yeah, so I mean, it's it keeps on changing your electrical grid system. Also, the carbon intensity of your electrical systems also change. So it's like, I think our data is pretty up to date, or as up to date as it can be. And yeah, not sure. Brad, have you heard of any tools that?
I mean, we kind of do it the same way. I mean, honestly, I think the biggest challenge in all that is like accurate utility data, and like if you have like that's, as you pointed to. I mean, and you know, a lot of the organizations we work with, in fact, I would say almost every organization we work with has some issue with getting accurate utility data for their whole portfolio. Like it's a challenge that it takes effort. Like, you know, you guys have gotten there, but like that took you a lot of effort. And a lot of organizations haven't finished putting in that effort yet. And it's often, you know, the first thing we find when we come into work with a portfolio, I'm like, okay, well, give us the data so we can start to benchmark this for you. And, you know, they're either like, well, here's some of it. Okay, where's the rest? Or they give you stuff. It's like, are you sure this is right? Because this doesn't look right. And then you quickly realize that, well, no. I mean, you look at enough energy data, you kind of know what you expect to see, and you can tell, you know, right away whether it's, you know, garbage or whether it's in the right ballpark. And there's a lot of garbage data out there. So honestly, to me, the biggest challenge with the carbon accounting is getting the utility data right. But if you've gotten the utility data right and accurate, then I think the carbon piece kind of follows. I mean, yeah, you have to mess around with emissions factors, but I mean that's honestly not that big a challenge in my mind.
Got it. Yeah, I've been digging into this category. It seems like people are improving upon, at least in the U.S., we have emissions factors that are a couple years old to several years old, and they're not necessarily always specific to your grid. And then a lot of times they're annual, right? So they're not necessarily matching up with the time you're actually using power. So you have, you know, technologies that are popping up and saying, well, if you don't have hourly meter data, then we'll estimate it for you. Right. And then we can give you a lot more accurate carbon data from that. Yeah. So and that's interesting really space.
It's really a function of like what your grid looks like too. I mean, here in BC, like it's not anywhere nearly that complicated. It's like they turn the dam on, they turn the dam off for the power. Like it's pretty consistent. But yeah, there's obviously other jurisdictions where you're turning up natural gas plants at certain times, and you've got that with you know, other sources. And then I can understand that being a bigger challenge in some markets for sure.
Totally.
Let's pause here for one more quick word from our sponsor, and then we'll get back to the show.
Longtime listeners will remember BrainBox AI from way back on episode 8 of the podcast. In that episode, we unpacked how BrainBox allows you to add AI, specifically reinforcement learning, to your existing HVAC control system, turning it into a predictive brain that learns precisely how to use less energy and optimize comfort in all building zones at all times. With BrainBox, you can reduce your carbon footprint, lower energy bills, and increase equipment life. Learn more by checking out the Westcliff Shopping Center success story at the link in the show notes. Let's dive into a couple different details of these projects. One is, I'd love to hear, maybe start with you, Brad. If you look across your clients, the types of technologies that are vital to making the roadmap happen, right? So we've talked about heat pumps. Maybe we can just gloss over that a little bit. Obviously, we need to electrify loads that were not electrified. But what sort of smart building technologies or other technologies are you seeing as vital to this process?
Okay, I've got a couple soapboxes to stand on this topic. So
please step up.
So I'll say, and maybe I'll sort of preface by saying, I think, like, you know, we say, like, yeah, put in a heat pump, like, as if it is that simple. And, you know, you get some cases where it is, like, you get rooftop units, sure, that's pretty easy. But, like, design, if we're talking about a central plant which is, you know, a big boiler plant or even like a central domestic hot water plant for some of these large buildings, like there's a lot of work into figuring out exactly what that replacement heat pump should look like. And I'll say the biggest thing comes down to like equipment sizing, and this does tie into smart buildings in a second, because like as we are, and as Leo alluded to, like heat pumps are expensive. Like I actually went to the effort one time of kind of doing a chart, and I think it was like dollars per BTU. And it had like kind of standard boiler systems, like high efficiency boiler systems, and then like heat pump systems.
Okay. The
heat pump costs are an order of magnitude more per BTU than a conventional gas boiler. And it's really linear. Like it's just like you can buy, you can buy a million BTU per hour boiler. You can buy 1.5 million like BTU per hour boiler, and you're not paying that much more. And the install cost is kind of the same. Like the incremental cost of more gas capacity in a building, like for heating, is not very high. It's not like for electrified systems, especially if we're talking heat pumps, it's not that way at all. Like it's very linear. Like you want more capacity, it's going to be more expensive. You want twice as much capacity, it's going to be almost twice as expensive. Both from like equipment cost point of view, install costs, you're bringing up electrical capacity. Like there's just it's I think there's some efficiencies of scale, but not the way there is with gas systems. So and the habit of engineers is to be conservative, right? Like that's
interesting.
One thing we're known of. So you oversize. One way you're conservative is you oversize the equipment. You have these generous safety factors that you apply. Even if you go through the effort of properly sizing a piece of equipment, you usually tack on a bit of a safety factor, or you buy a second boiler for redundancy and you put that in and you call it a day, and you're left with way more boiler capacity than you actually need. Owners can't afford to do that when they electrify. You just can't afford the same level of redundancy and like oversized equipment, in my opinion. Like that is going to make the journey to electrification and decarbonization so much slower if you're expecting that same level of sort of resilience and safety in your designs. So the way you get around that is, especially if we're talking about retrofits, let's use the data. Like, and this is something hardly any engineer does when they're designing a piece of equipment. Like we've got handbooks and we've got models, but in an existing building, we should be using the data. And this is where the smart building systems come in, because they can provide all of that data. And what we have found when we've started looking at the data is really interesting. You find out that a lot of the traditional rules of thumb and models are like totally wrong. I'd like to give this example from the domestic hot water systems. So we actually we decarbonized a domestic hot water system, one of Leo's buildings recently. So we did, and it's a big, 100 and I forget how many suites are in there, 100, almost 200 suites. So it's a good sized building. So we put a meter on there to actually measure the domestic hot water usage. And the usage profile was completely different from what the handbooks will tell you is kind of a standard domestic hot water profile in a multi-unit residential building. They'll say, morning peak, low during the day, evening peak. That's what it looks like. Yeah. Of course, now we're taking data. This was actually still kind of in the middle of COVID when we were doing this, but it actually honestly hasn't changed that much since. That we saw kind of, small morning peak, high load consistent throughout the day, another evening peak. But when we're doing heat pumps, like that really matters because not to get too much into the technical side of things, but like the heat pump systems have a lot fewer BTUs, so you rely on more storage. And you kind of rely on these downtimes to recharge the system. Well, knowing that the building's at a pretty high constant load all day really affects how much storage and the whole design of the system. So I'd say without that data, we would have designed a totally different system, and one that wouldn't have served the needs of the building quite as well. And just interesting, that building before we did the project, it had two 600,000 BTU boilers for domestic hot water. We ended up doing a hybrid system, and this is kind of another story, but we had to run on the boilers. We had boilers and heat pumps kind of together. But we, for a while, we had to run on just the boilers, and we had 200,000 BTU boilers, so 1/3 the size. That was enough for the building. So the old system was 3 times oversized from what they actually needed, and this was during a period when with higher than normal use because there's just so many more people at home now during the day in the building. And then we've got same story I could tell you on the heating systems. Like the old saying goes like all models are wrong, some models are useful. In my opinion, especially with existing buildings, like forget about models. Like let's use the data. Like let's leverage the BAS infrastructure. And I think this is a way that we haven't traditionally thought of these smart building systems. They're often justified for building operations or for energy use or for occupant comfort. So I'm saying now, like what I'm telling clients and sort of, one of the soapboxes I'm on is there's another use case for smart building systems and for BAS. And it is as like critical input data for designing low carbon systems for your building. That if you don't have that data, you are not going to design your systems properly. They will probably be oversized and a lot more expensive than they need to be compared to as if you had good data to design on. So I think that's where smart building, and then not even to get into the operation of these systems, but again, to use the example of this residential, I mean, they had 2 gas boilers. I mean, you could run that whole system off an aquastat, but now we've got 10 heat pumps, an electric heater, 2 boilers, a bunch of storage tanks. They're all connected, and we've got mixing valves, and it's a lot more sophisticated system. So we need a lot more BAS infrastructure to operate these low carbon systems compared to sort of conventional natural gas systems. They're more complicated, and so you need that smart building infrastructure to effectively operate them.
Absolutely. Makes perfect sense. So you're needing more controls, more sensor, more actuator, more controllers than you had before. It sounds like also there's a need for analyzing the data itself, right? So some sort of analytics layer is helpful. Leo, how much of your sort of decarbonization roadmap is sort of intertwined with a technology roadmap, if that exists?
It absolutely is. I mean, we're currently piloting 3 smart building systems in buildings. They're all 3 offices. We just wanted to see what we can do and how much we can improve the efficiency in those buildings. And we chose our 2 corporate office buildings, and we chose another building we have in the portfolio that's already very efficient, just because the team wanted to see what if we throw a smart building system into an already efficient building. Can we still improve the building even further, or what else do we get out from this technology? Like what other information is there that's possibly or potentially of value? And so back in the day, before these smart building systems became more and more popular, where it was more like driven by young engineers going through the weather data and going through the BS data and hoping to find out why chiller 1 fires up in the middle of the night. And so it was really interesting. After they cleaned up the data and really dug into all the little details, we saw an average improvement of 20% in energy efficiency across office buildings. So that tells you, and that changes the conversation again to efficiency, right? from decarbonization, which is
AI
amazing.
and machine learning is better than a skilled engineer, is what you're saying.
Probably. No, that's not what I'm saying. We'll always see. I mean, like now AI systems are currently, I think, at 15%. So let's see if they're as good as the engineers. But so far the system's been running since February in 1 building, and I think we're currently seeing a 15% gas use decrease. So it's
you're talking about, when you say smart building system, you're talking about sort of an advanced control layer, right?
It's like a brain that sits on top of the BS system.
Got it.
And pretty much takes over, and has access to 7-day weather data, and potentially if you have occupancy sensors in the building, it utilizes whatever information it can get, right, to run the building as efficiently as possible. So the plan is, and unfortunately a lot of our residential buildings don't have a BAS system, or at least not a sophisticated BAS system that could potentially be controlled by a smart building AI system in the end. So our strategy currently is to install these BAS systems in those buildings that don't have it yet. And then for the other buildings that already have a BAS system to look into some sort of AI technology to have that sitting on top of the BAS system to, really adjust the buildings and run them as efficiently as possible, and also improve tenant comfort in the building.
So if I put my real estate hat on for a second, which I don't wear very often because I'm an engineer, but if I sort of replay back this conversation and I were to tell this to, a property manager or an asset manager, we've talked about not having a very good payback. We've talked about electrification costing more, and now we're talking about all this technology that we didn't have before in certain cases that we have to add on now because the systems are more sophisticated. How are you making that business case for all of this?
Yeah, that's the challenging part. With the AI technology, it's pretty simple because your paybacks are usually pretty good, right? Like the installation or the upfront costs are not extremely high. So usually asset managers feel more comfortable. And then there is potential to access funding and from various sources that, it's also always a great incentive for the team to agree to a project that's a bit, higher in the upfront cost. Mm-hmm. I would say
local incentives and
local incentives or even federal incentives. Those type of projects are still considered to be pilots. So sometimes if you're lucky, you can get access to those innovation funds as well. Mm-hmm. That cover for it. And but either way, your payback is usually pretty short, right? Because you expect operational savings, and once the system is up and running, there's not a huge ongoing fee associated with it. There's some software updates, but that's pretty much it. So once the system's up and running, then you really, you see the savings in the data, and after 2, maybe 3 years, it pays for itself. So those type of projects are usually pretty simple. It gets more complicated to sell a heat pump project where the incremental cost is, 3 times as high as the initially budgeted cost for a heat pump or a boiler replacement or a standard RTU. And one thing we noticed was, and that was part of our decarbonization audit exercise, we asked Brad and his team and the other consultants who worked on this to really show us how much would the project cost us if we just went for the like-for-like replacement, or switch out an old boiler for a high-efficiency condensing boiler. And then option B would be a heat pump combination, like a hybrid between boilers and heat pumps. And option C would be then the all-electric. We noticed that option B in most cases gets us to the 70-80% carbon reduction. So for the case we've been working with Brad on at the residential building, where we just retrofitted the domestic hot water system, I think the overall building emissions and the gas usage went down by, or is expected to go down by 50%. We have had some other heat pump and backup boiler projects where we could even save, or depending on if there's other equipment that uses gas in the building or not. But where I'm going with this is that, if you want to go all electric, we see that those last 30 or 20% cost you almost as much as those first 70%, 80%, right? So we've kind of internally agreed to, let's not look into these all electric projects because we can't really justify it, right? Because a lot of these costs are recoverable, so they have to be passed on to the tenants in some form, depending on how these costs are handled with the building budgets. But anyways, when we look into these hybrid options, the costs, Brad, and correct me if I'm wrong, we have seen positive paybacks if we consider lifecycle costing and increased carbon tax, right? So that was the first time we ran the analysis and we got positive net present values due to the carbon tax and inflation and gas prices too. And those are the numbers your asset managers want to see too, right? I mean, they do agree. Yes, of course, we have carbon targets in place as an organization. We need to get there, but we also want to make sure that the numbers add up in the end.
Yeah, and I think, to add to that, I think, that's consistent with the conversation we have with other clients as well, is to find let's find the best path to low carbon. Let's find those most cost-effective tons to save. And sometimes, that's going to cost you. You do even end up slightly negative on the net present values sometimes. But if that's your best option, then okay, that's our best option. And I'd say that really also when the organization's commitment to their carbon targets plays a role too. Like if they are ironclad committed to those targets, then you can have a very different conversation than if it's a little bit wishy-washy and they're not. Some organizations, again, the ones that don't have that solid roadmap, and haven't done the work to get to the building level, are still kind of shocked sometimes when they see what it actually means on a project by project basis. And I found that even though they have the target, they're not quite comfortable yet, taking the action and saying, okay, we're going to do the heat pump instead of the boiler. So I think the organization, to get there really has to be that commitment to the roadmap and to the targets, almost as a prerequisite to having the rest of the conversations. Because if they're not there yet, it's going to be really hard, because these are still new projects. Things come up, things go wrong. Leo and I can tell you a dozen stories from this last project where, I would say the commitment to that project, if it wasn't there, it would have been easy at some points to say, nah, okay, this is too much. We're gonna bail and do the safe thing here. So, and I guess the only other thing that's coming into some of our conversations, on top of kind of these internal targets that are driven by ESG programs, is I know New York has local ordinance around carbon targets. Vancouver has one now as well, for a certain class of large buildings. We call them the carbon pollution limits. It's so many tons per square foot. And so now clients are actually looking at that, and since that was passed, having a lot more conversations, even with sort of clients who haven't been historically very sustainability minded. They're like, okay, what does this mean? Will this building meet those limits? If not, what do I need to do to get there? And that's kind of entering the conversation now when we're talking about boiler replacements or other gas equipment replacements. It's like, okay, is this going to be a problem for me? And if it is, I may make a different choice, which honestly is exactly what the ordinances are meant to do. So it's in that way it's being successful. But so we're starting to see the regulation come into play now. In addition to, here we've kind of got, it's almost the trifecta. You've got sort of the, corporate sustainability and corporate, corporations wanting to sort of, do the right thing because, their image is on the line. We've got carbon pricing signals and now regulations on sort of the other end saying, this is a hard limit now that you can't exceed. So the combination of those things, I think, has really been what, at least, here has kind of moved the market for us. And it is working its way into the conversations that we're having when we're planning projects.
Got it. Makes sense. Makes total sense. Yeah, and I'm hearing that from a bunch of different cities right now. So, Brad, you said you had multiple soapbox items to bring up. Do you have anything else you want to stand on the soapbox for?
Well, okay. It's a lot. It's along the same lines actually as the smart building. It's very much in sort of the smart building realm, but and interesting to see how Leo and Concert's kind of tackling it. But you heard Leo say, well, a lot of our residential systems don't have, or a lot of residential buildings don't have much of a building automation system. They don't have much for smart building systems. But as soon as you decide to put in a low carbon system, if it's a central system, you are going to need that building automation system. And I think there's, the commercial sector, we've been dealing with recommissioning and retro commissioning, ongoing commissioning. We've been having those conversations for 15 years. I'd say the commercial sector understands that well, but I think our industry is going to have a whole new challenge where we have all of these building owners who have not had sophisticated building automation before, all of a sudden are going to be in possession of them. And we're going to have this conversation all over again, 20 years after we had it the first time. Yeah, with new technology, with new tools, but I think that's something we need to really be ready for. Because I even saw it again in this project that we did with Leo, and even in the commissioning of it. The contractor didn't understand what this system was meant to do. I had to explain several times that no, we don't want to use the boiler. We want to use the heat pumps. That is the whole point of this project. The boilers are backup. And to have to explain, because people just aren't used to it. Contractors aren't used to it. They didn't understand that this was a carbon reduction project, or how this system was intended to operate. And that was good feedback for us as the designers. And now that would be probably the first thing I would do in a project startup meeting, is sit them down and explain like the design intent and the functional objective of the building, and not just assume that, they'll see the heat pumps and they'll know what's going on. Even with the sequence of operations, I had to go back and sort of walk them through line by line. Here's how we want it to work, even though it was a relatively simple sequence. Just like it was so different from what they were used to doing, and that it was hard to get it to work the way we wanted. And for a long time, it was like the boilers were running 24/7, and like we. As the design engineer, had to literally read the code line by line to figure out where it wasn't right, point that out to the programmer so that they could go fix it. Like it was a painful commissioning process that we had, and it would have been honestly kind of easy to say, yeah, everything is done. Go through your commissioning checklist, check it off, leave them with a system that is maybe getting 10% of the carbon reduction that it had the potential to get to because of a few lines of code being wrong. And you can imagine what that means for persistence, and like how on it now the operators are going to have to be for the life of this system to prevent that sort of thing from happening. And we've seen it for years in recommissioning and ongoing commissioning, but I would say the stakes are higher now. Because virtually every one of these hybrid systems that we've worked on, and we've worked on a lot that we haven't designed, we get called in to do recommissioning projects. 9 times out of 10, the boiler is running and the heat pump is off, or the heat pump is barely doing anything. It's like it's tripped out. It's like nobody knows. The operator can't be bothered with it because they see it as this high maintenance piece of equipment. The boiler satisfies the tenants, and they know how a boiler works. They're comfortable with that. But meanwhile, the owner, who has spent a lot of money on these low carbon systems, isn't getting the value out of it. And so this is going to be, it is a problem already. And I can only imagine, the scale of the problem as we go forward and start to roll out, start to decarbonize on a large scale. And this is where I've kind of thought that the conversation that, a lot of the conversation is focused on, okay, how do you prioritize the projects? How do you do the projects? Let's find a heat pump, put in a heat pump. And I'm kind of like, well, yes, like that's important, but let's not underestimate the challenge in front of us from once these heat pump systems are in, because keeping those systems working and delivering on the carbon reduction is going to be an ongoing challenge that our industry is going to have to tackle and have to take really seriously, because I've already seen a bunch of these white elephants that, a bunch of money spent on a project that's not delivering, the carbon reduction that it was supposed to. And I think, that also creates a bad reputation. People say, well, I spent all this money, I'm not getting the value out of it. Why would I keep spending money on this? That could kind of derail the whole decarbonization challenge. So anyway, I think our industry needs to take that really seriously and get out in front of it. And that's a challenge from, starts with the consultants, but goes through, the contractors and the operations teams. Again, nothing different than the conversation we've been having in the commercial real estate side for forever, but we're going to have to keep having that conversation and bring it kind of into the 2020s with us, because it's going to be there.
I'd say it's a huge obstacle though, because we've been having this conversation. I spent a lot of my career so far having that conversation, which is it's important that you commission your control system, and then you also probably want analytics and monitoring also, right? That was, a huge part of my career so far. But not everyone has taken that to heart. Not everyone has listened to that message. Not everyone has implemented that message. And so I guess it's a big obstacle for then taking that and expanding the number of buildings that now have more sophisticated systems, now have control systems, now need those control systems to perform. Yeah, I'm totally with you. It's a great lesson.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's opportunity there too, and I think this is where our industry needs to, understand this push for decarbonization and understand that this isn't just about heat pump manufacturers selling more heat pumps. It's about everyone in the smart building industry upping their game, and there's a big opportunity here to sell our services to make the low carbon building work. And I think we can't undervalue our role but understand that these conversations are taking place around carbon and that is a driver now for investment in buildings, and increasingly I know as part of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, and Canada's looking at similar legislation here, like there's a lot of money going into low carbon systems, and that I think the smart building industry's role is to make them work right.
Exactly. Which is why we're having this conversation. Yeah. So let's end, Leo. So back to the fact that you guys are ahead of the game in terms of creating a plan, creating a roadmap that actually has real actions in it. Can you let's just close off with some tips that you might have around others that are behind you on that journey to get to that sort of concrete plan. What tips do you have for them?
Yeah, so my tips would be to focus first on getting data, right? Like before you start any carbon commitments, targets, or even looking into projects, you need to have a solid baseline. And so that allows you to make any assumptions where your carbon target could be at. And so what I've seen in the industry, and that worries me too. We talked about this at the beginning, that most of these targets, whether it's 50% by 2030 or carbon neutral by 2050, they're purely based on an assumption or organizations signing up for the Science Based Target Initiative. And I'm glad that Concert is one of the organizations that that's too scary for us. We do not want to announce a target and by 2028 we reduced our carbon by 10%, or it just didn't work. So what I highly recommend is looking into every building, and either that's with a consultant or with the on-site staff, and checking the equipment replacement schedules. And I would put a list together of those buildings that are coming up in the next few years, and I would focus my decarbonization roadmap on those buildings, because like we said at the beginning, if you miss a boiler system or a heat pump or a rooftop unit or anything now, then you're going to be stuck with the old system again for the next 15 to 20 years. And so with that data, I would just develop this roadmap and come up with an estimate. What is a real number that can be achieved in the next 7-8 years. And without overpromising anything, I would also discuss that with the asset management team if they feel comfortable implementing these projects. Because like our senior management team, although we have those numbers and we have the costs and we have the carbon reduction predictions based on the consultants' analyses, we're still hesitant announcing a target publicly, because a lot of these projects are still in very early stages, and a lot of them are pilots. Even our smart building project is still a pilot, right? It has not really been tested here in Vancouver, at least, or along the West Coast. So we don't really know if the predicted carbon savings are 15%, 20% or less. So we'll probably wait a couple of more years before we make an announcement, just to get more data and more information. And I think that's key. I think everyone should collect data as much as they can, and then also share the outcomes of each project, because the project we're currently working with Brad on will be an exciting one, because we have the exact same building right next to that one. So it could be a carbon copy of the project if it turns out to be as efficient and the carbon reduction holds what it promises. Then this project could potentially be implemented across our BC portfolio at all sites that have a similar system. So I think, it will be a lesson learned. I think we have to share a lot of information in that field because a lot of the heat pump technology or the way we're currently installing it with the backup boilers is still new to many landlords and property owners, right? So I think the more we share from our experience, the better or the easier it will be for others to make a similar decision.
Totally. Let's close out with some what I call carve-outs. Any book or podcast or any other type of media really that has had a major impact on you lately. Start with you, Brad.
I'm glad there's a heads up for that question. I've got young kids, so I don't have much time to read. But I do listen to a lot of podcasts, and I would say lately, the one that's had the most impact on my thinking it's one I'm sure a lot of people have heard of is Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History podcast. But what I like about it, the content is often fascinating, but just the way it just takes a total different perspective on something that either you've never really thought of in depth before, or you've already kind of thought of one way, and just kind of flip the way you look at something. I try to keep that in mind for my work because I think often there's interesting answers when you just look at a problem from a different perspective. So that's one I've been enjoying because it just always is kind of challenges your expectations and makes you think.
Brilliant. I remember I listened to the first couple episodes, but haven't listened to it in a few years. Yeah. Maybe I'll circle back to it.
Good. Fellow Canadian.
There you go. How about you, Leo?
Expat, but.
So I would say I've been reading a lot of frameworks lately. I presented our decarbonization roadmap at Buildex earlier this year, and I can't remember the context here, but we started discussing different ESG frameworks, and so it kind of triggered a whole conversation around our own framework, whether that's still up to date or not up to date. So I started reading a lot of frameworks that are currently out there from international organizations pretty much all over the world, and that really helped me to understand what others are doing in the field, and what opportunities are out there. Regarding podcasts, I do like listening to The Economist, particularly the topics that are on the energy market, the energy crisis in Europe. I think there's a lot we can learn here in North America too. I mean, we're less affected, luckily, than the European market, but it's also kind of changed my way of thinking of how we use energy and how easily prices for gas or electricity can increase rapidly.
Totally. Back to the frameworks. What are the top one or two frameworks that if you've dug into this topic, where should people start?
Oh, so what I noticed is that these frameworks are pretty much all over the place. There's no real guidance like what you have to include in your framework, or if it should be a combination of a ESG report and a framework, if it is a document that's 60 pages long or a policy that's 3 pages long, which is great, right? There's that also makes me wonder, how much do we actually know about these things, right? If there's no consistency even in how we develop our frameworks.
I'm pretty sure we're all just making this up as we go along.
Probably. And you can also tell by how often these frameworks are being changed. So so we were back at the drawing board again at Concert 2 to redesign our framework. I mean, we had a 2019 version uploaded to our website. It was 64 pages long or so. We noticed that's might not be the easiest document we can share with the organization, because who reads 64 pages, right? So if we could get that down to 5 pages, maybe that would be key. Well, we'll see how that goes.
Got it. All right. Well, thanks, you two. This has been super insightful. I like how practical, down to earth it is from real experience. So thank you for sharing.
Cool. It was fun.
Yeah, it's awesome.
All right, friends, thanks for listening to this episode of the Nexus Podcast. For more episodes like this and to get the weekly Nexus newsletter, which, by the way, readers have said is the best way to stay up to date on the future of the smart buildings industry, please subscribe at at nexuslabs.online. You can find the show notes for this conversation there as well. Have a great day.